Okay. So this time we have a really interesting piece. It's one of the earliest pieces we know that Gadamer has published from 1924. It's called On the Idea of a System in Philosophy. And it was recently translated by Haley Burke and Frida Neumann. And Haley's here with us today. So, Haley, do you want to start things out? Say a little bit of why you decided to translate this and anything else you want to share about it?
Yeah, certainly. Cut me off at any time. Also, I'm really excited to talk about this text with you guys and see what you think. Hopefully, it was a worthwhile read, even though I know Gadamer's prose, especially if you read it in the German, is pretty terrible in this text. And in fact, I think it's in Grandin or De Cesare's biography where Gadamer's talking about this text and not putting it in his collected works. He says, "This I'm too much of an amateur in this text. I wouldn't want this in my collected works." Um, but Frito, who sends his regrets, he would have liked to have been here today. He and I decided to translate this piece. Um, I guess we saw the reason to translate it as being that it had not been translated for into English, and it had not been republished in the German in a really long time. I brought the text to him because I was interested in what Heidegger may have, or sorry, what Gadamer may have taken from Heidegger when he sat in on the lecture course from 1923 on the hermeneutics of facticity. I was curious to see if he had anything to say in particular about formal indication. We thought maybe Gadamer did. In fact, not exactly. But what we found to be really interesting about this piece was that it marks the clear break from like the neo-Kantian school of thought that Gadamer makes and his transition to phenomenology. Um, when I read this text, it's very clear that Gadamer is concerned with what the things themselves are indicating or how they are directing thought towards the individual researcher. So suddenly, Gadamer is interested in how facticity is contributing to knowledge. That was a little bit of a ramble, but I had a couple more things that I wanted to say. As David mentioned, this is the first or one of the earliest pieces that Gadamer publishes. The other one is a review of one of Nikolai Hartmann's books. But this is the first original piece that Gadamer had published, and it was published for Paul Nautworp's, I think, 70th birthday festschrift or 80th birthday festschrift. Um, yeah, okay. What else did I want to say about this? I guess he's contributing to debates at the time that are concerned with what to do with the role of history in relation to eternal knowledge. So that's a theme that comes up again. Heidegger also discusses this in GA 59. And so if you compare the two texts, I think there's quite a few interesting resonances. And I also think that you get a clear, I don't know, a clear early indication of what Gadamer will later say about historically affected consciousness. So it's nice to see that that idea is germinating so early on in his thought. Um, yeah, and again, I also think that facticity looms large in the background here, especially at the end when he's talking about the relationship between the researcher and the idea of a system. But that was a lot of rambling ideas that I have about this text. Really curious to see what you all think. Thanks for the support and the time, David.
No, that's great, Haley. Thanks. I appreciate it. That lays out.
Yep.
I think I read in Grandin, I think his piece on neo-Kantianism, that this was going to be
Yep.
part of the Gesamtwerke until it was in his like table of contents, and then he decided at the last minute to drop it out. So it came close,
Yeah.
um,
Would have been nice, but
but
it was fun to translate.
gave you an opportunity to translate it. Yeah, so this is the time. The way we usually start, as I say, is there something in here that is so important to you, so weighing on you, it would just be painful to have to wait before we take it up. You want to, is there some section where you just think, I just cannot wait to talk about this? John, Shaba?
Sorry for beginning with this question, but I would heartily discuss now or later this neo-Kantian concept of problem history, Problemgeschichte, and also Gadamer's criticism of this, because at the very beginning on page 57 in the English version, Gadamer formulates very provocative statements like the unsolvability of the problems as indicative of their philosophical character, the undecidability and open uncertainty of the problem, and so on. And it seems so. He in later in the paper he doesn't really modify or limitate this approach. And I mean, I of course understand his arguments against a view of history philosophy as a series of answers to eternal problems. So I understand his arguments, but he suggests at the same time as somewhat perplexing relativism, or he simply makes not really really clear how we should deal with problems from earlier periods. And I'm very sympathetic with reading Gadamer as phenomenologist, but phenomenology would also insist on having some systematic relevance, and just a philological remark. The German philosopher Hermann Schnedelbach, whose assistant of Adorno, wrote a very witty article against the hermeneutic illness, Morbus hermeneuticus, Thesen zu einer hermeneutischen Krankheit. So the hermeneutic death seizes on a philosophical illness, which also attacks such an approach to history philosophy. So I would be grateful for comments on this.
Okay, great, Shaba. That's a lot. But would you say that Gadamer at this early stage is more sympathetic to the problem, the history of problems approach, history of philosophy? He sees certain versions of it, he sees as a problem, but he does seem like he wants to try to save it here.
But yeah, I mean, what is clear of what he is clear favoring is an approach to problems in the history of philosophy in a very contextualizing, historically well-informed
Right.
manner. But I mean that's at the same time the reason why problems formulated in earlier historical contexts don't really seem very relevant for us today. So it would be interesting to compare this critique of Problemgeschichte of history of problem history with the claims on the classical in truth and method,
Right.
which seems to be how to say the theoretical means for Heidegger for Gadamer to overcome historicism. What he's saying against Problemgeschichte, those are the historicist arguments against such a too rigid conception of eternal problems, I would say. But
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't
No, that
know.
makes sense. Okay, great. I think we're definitely going to have to answer those questions today. Those are right in the forefront of this paper, right? So it would be really a shame if we haven't clarified that by the end of 2 hours of Science Fair. Niall, do you have things on your mind that you really want to get in on?
Firstly, to see here. Okay.
Okay.
Much
These are
better.
these are new AirPods, and I still haven't figured them out. So,
Okay.
okay. So the thing I wanted to ask a little bit about was the definition of phenomenology that he's working with, because to say it's phenomenological, then what kind of but on page 23, I had this sneaking suspicion it was very Husserlian, right?
Mhm.
There's this reference to the inexhaustibility of the object,
Mhm.
that cognition, the object will always exceed cognition, that it has this kind of infinity of kind of givenness that cognition can never exhaust. And there is a there's almost a suppression of the role of language in this text.
Mhm.
There's kind of one reference to language, which is a reference to predication, as far as I can understand, right? There is really like assertions that this inkwell is brown or something like that is the only reference to the role that language would have to play in this type of phenomenology, which is markedly different from the 1923 ontology, the hermeneutics of facticity, where language is understood as this kind of opening force, this kind of disclosive force, not merely a kind of pre-predicative force. But by pages 24 and 25, there seems to be this rejection of the possibility of an impartial methodological spectator position, which is the rejection of Husserlian phenomenology. So it's a kind of inner tension between the spectatorial methodological distanciation that you find in Husserlian phenomenology from page 23, which seems to be a kind of a commitment to the infinity and the richness of the object always exceeding our apprehension of the object, like a thing in itself in the Kantian sense, Husserl once says about the object, right? The rule of perception. So because I think the translators, you make that reference in the introduction, quoting Figal, that there's this kind of Tiefsdimension, this depth dimension to, but I'm wondering, well, which phenomenology is it? Is it a Heideggerian phenomenology? Is it a Husserlian phenomenology? What's the difference? And I think that would be an important set of questions. And the role of language in this text, or the lack of a role for language in this text.
Yeah. All right. Great question. And especially you're focusing on the section on truth at the end,
Yeah.
right? That's where I understand. Okay, Eric,
Yeah, just to keep adding to the list of topics, but I
writing it
wanted
down.
to note, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to note some like really beautiful phrases like the rhythm of ephemeralities and partial truth is a misery for philosophy. Just those were great. So there's two or three like topics that I would love to talk about, like the trickle down from neo-Kantianism, history of problems, into like the typical academic practice in philosophy classrooms. Like if we're studying intro to philosophy, we're going to talk about free will, we're going to talk about, right, like mind independent reality, like these, like what is an example of a problem in the so-called history of problems. So it's like, does Plato believe in free will, right?
Mm.
Like something like this, where we project our contemporary questions back onto them and like, how does Plato solve the problem? So that's one thing I wanted to talk about. The other thing is this kind of distinction between problems and questions, that philosophy is about like showing the objective questionableness of things. And then he puts this question that's like, there are no wrong, it's the question is, are there really any wrongly posed questions?
Mm.
And I wanted to, you know, like, aren't there wrongly posed questions? Like, have you stopped beating your dog yet? And then the last one is just that beautiful remark at the beginning that's like, our only hope for a genuine system is really in aphorisms or symbols, right? Like, to like, why is it that a symbol seems, or an aphorism seems more capable of capturing the system than a fully articulated system like Hegel or something like that? So those three things were like really interesting to me.
All right, thanks. I got him, Eric. And he doesn't give me any examples in this reading, but later when he talks about he criticizes the history of problems as leveling the differences. His example is almost always your example, is thinking the Stoics meant by freedom is what we mean by freedom. And I thought of an example of an ill-formed question is, what is Plato's theory of sin? You might say, well, why, the very question doesn't make much sense, right? So it seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to ask. John Arthos.
Yeah, so the striking thing to me is the word system itself, the way it's used, because system and system thinking it becomes a devil term for him later on. It's sort of one of the great themes, his attack against classification and categorization, and that's all of that. And here he's problematizing it, but he seems to it's within the realm. It's sort of he dialectizes it, right, with the particular in a way that's sort of similar to what he does later with the idea of the universal, right? So it's this irreal, um, uh, regulative ideal. He's not dismissing it at all. And so the word seems to me. So I was wondering whether this was just an early developmental issue that word itself would change its meaning for him, or was it, that he wanted, was there more tactical diplomacy involved in how he's approaching, the neo-Kantians, or was it just an absence of vocabulary, or was it a lack of confidence in taking a strong critical stance? Um, so the so he brings up Kierkegaard. I mean, obviously Kierkegaard is important here, and one of the things I was wondering about this word is, did the word have the same sort of toxic resonance that it does for us today after people like Gadamer, you know, called it into such severe question? Because in the 18th and 19th century, did it have a different kind of a valence? Because we've got the criticism, the Kierkegaardian criticism of Hegelian system thinking, and then we have Nietzsche criticizing, the Systemslust. So my question would be, historically, what's the valence of that term, and how is he relating to that term?
Yeah, that's great. Can I suggest we start with that? Since that's something that we can really look into, see what he says about it, see what his examples are. Maybe we can think about what a defender of systematic philosophical thinking might look like, or what sort of targets he might have in mind. Um, One thing that struck me he might have in mind are sort of Weltanschauung thinkers who might say to really understand Leibniz, you need to get into his worldview and understand the way it sort of forms a system, right? It is a collection of interdefined concepts that function together. And some are central that set up certain problems as relevant that shape certain problems in various terms, not other terms, that provide for answers to some problems, not others. And this would be kind of a system, the Leibnizian conceptual system. And then you can talk about that for a number of different thinkers, the Thomistic system of thought. That was one way I was trying. I always need examples, so I always try to put in my own examples here, someone like that. And I can imagine too, you could have Kantians talking about a system of concepts, right? Neo-Kantians talking about a system of concepts, the way concepts are sort of logically and semantically interconnected, so that to do philosophy properly is to map out the necessary relations among these concepts. That'd be a different approach. That's not about doing history of philosophy and trying to get into the system of a thinker. That's saying what matters for philosophy is understanding the conceptual relations among these concepts. I mean, that's two thoughts up to the top of my head. Do other people have thoughts about what the target is here for when Gadamer talks about system and systematic thinking?
Well,
Eric?
I kept thinking about Paul Tillich because he's working at Marburg in 1924 to 1925. Um, and he's developing his systematic theology right at the same time. So this conversation about systems is kind of interdisciplinary to the degree that, we want to position Tillich more as a theologian than a philosopher. And I see Tillich kind of trying to develop this uh, open-ended system, like a opens, right? His system is about the question answer correlation, and that the system is you have the philosophical questions, religious resources as answers to those questions, and then the job of theology is to coordinate them. And so the system, right, this is a perfect example of a system being connected to a method. So I don't think Tillich is the target that Gadamer is criticizing, because I don't know if I've ever even heard Gadamer mention Tillich. Um, it talks about Boltzmann, but not Tillich. So it's, but that's just one example that kept coming to mind for me. This, like, I hear more systems talk in philosophical theology than, after Kierkegaard or Nietzsche or something like that with philosophy.
And what is it that makes it systematic? There's a method that shows you how you can answer questions across theology. Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah,
A
yeah,
defined method?
yeah.
Okay.
And through that method, you generate kind of the answers for now that hang together
Mm.
into a system. But for him, he wants it to be sufficiently open-ended so that it can adapt to new things.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Other thought. Yeah, Shaba.
I think there's a more so narrower and a broader concept of system. The narrower concept obviously belonging to German idealism and to early modern philosophy, where it is assumed that there must be either a single or a very few basic principles which should determine all other true propositions that belong together in a systematic form. That's a very very demanding idea of system and a somewhat broader concept would be just like neo-Kantianism, a kind of general overall description of how certain basic philosophy's problems should be addressed and I think what Gadamer has in mind is simply the contrast of such an approach to the history of philosophy. So rather in analogy to a scientific theory, which says that I don't care that I'm doing biology today. I don't care the different earlier theories because they are irrelevant. The idea of system idea in a somewhat broader sense could mean this. I mean, the problem I addressed at the beginning is that Gadamer himself somehow demands to formulate insights in a systematic way, in a broader sense. So he's also making efforts to reach some more general descriptions where it doesn't really seem where his way of doing philosophy and the broader concept of system could be grasped. But okay, so that's only my proposal. These two meanings of system.
Yeah, that helps. And also the idea that Gadamer himself is engaged in a kind of systematic philosophizing, if you understand it in the broad sense. Yeah. Yeah, John Arthos.
Yeah, it could be a bit of a performative contradiction depending on how you look at it. I did want to mention Dilthey because Dilthey was clearly wanting to develop a system. He was very clear about that. But I was reading, and we talked about him last time, Rudy's McCreel's book on Dilthey, and he has this very poignant story about Dilthey because Dilthey was known as a man of first volumes. That was the sort of the phrase that was going on about it, because he could never finish any project, right? All these projects were going on, but these were all systematic projects, right? Um, and so McCreel says Dilthey's inability to complete his planned works was the result of his conviction that systematic conclusions should not be arrived at in a psychoanalytic in a vacuum. Theories cannot be productive unless thoroughly grounded in historical scholarship. He believed that philosophy is its history. And so McCreel almost suggests that Dilthey's conviction, right, that that this work that he's doing exists in a historical context in a way in which Dilthey perhaps didn't even understand in his, drive to find the systematic solution, was anticipating what Heidegger and Gadamer would later, you know, mature this idea that this sort of suspicion of systems thinking.
May I say just very briefly to something to that? I mean, I think that the fundamental difference of Heidegger and Gadamer, as opposed to Dilthey, is their insistence on the insight that we have to reach via phenomenological method and treating at least certain questions and problems. And I addressed before the analysis of the classical in Gadamer. It is I think something Gadamer wants to mobilize against Dilthey's relativistic historicism, and in that sense I don't really think that Heidegger and Gadamer simply continue Dilthey's historically oriented way of doing philosophy. You are quite right. There is a positivist heritage in Dilthey as well. He attempted to first to elaborate epistemological foundations for the human studies, and his whole work can be grasped as a series of attempts to reformulate this project, but it fails at the end, on the basis of fundamental insights of historicity of our thought. And Heidegger and Gadamer, even if they acknowledge the historicity of our thinking, they emphasize always that we have questions that we have to find answers to, or we are striving for eminent experiences and so on and so on. And that's I think a difference to the late Dilthey's somewhat desperate relativistic remarks. Okay, sorry.
What I really like about this debate is I mean, Dilthey takes very seriously the history of philosophy. He's struggling with it. He thinks it's essential to do important philosophical work, to do it historically. But so do the Neo-Kantians. They're famous for their work on Plato and history of philosophy. They think history of philosophy is essential for doing philosophy. And then so is Gadamer and Heidegger and even Husserl this time with this sort of genetic turn inspired by Nautorp and others is getting more concerned about history of philosophy. So all these thinkers right around the same time, all trying to take seriously the importance for the history of philosophy, for philosophizing, and all trying to sort of find different ways in which this is going to be done and make the case for their version of it, as opposed to some of the others on the table. So that always strikes me as an exciting time in history of philosophy when we have like these big movements very close to each other and differentiating themselves and trying to differentiate themselves in careful ways. Should we look at some of the places where Gadamer talks about a system to try to get a better sense of what he's going to agree with at the end and what he's going to agree with, so we can sort of get clear where he's going to draw the line and what he's going to say, what kind of systemic thinking or systematic thinking is out and what might be unproblematic. Because I don't get the sense he's trying. Later, John said it's what, a double word or something. I don't think he's at this point he is dismissing all systematic thinking, right? John Beach.
Yeah. I'd like to confess that I left it too late to really read it properly. And so I skipped over the commentary at the first. And I just want to offer briefly my sort of my intuitive take on it, which may be, which was he really only came to what he was saying on the very last page. And I see it basically, there's and an implicit dialogue going on here between, with Aristotle and uh, um, it's between, of course, it's Hegel is it's a sort of, I think he's criticizing Hegel from the point of view of Aristotle, and I think that the that's the connection with the 23 course, I guess,
Right.
and that he's trying to say that systematicity, it's all, um, it's you're starting out with a position, whereas he's saying that investigation, number one, it's personal, it has to be a real philosophical question, and I think he's thinking more of like um, aporia, instead of, like, later on he just completely destroys this concept of history of problems right to the very end, but um, he's looking at something that comes up at the end of the investigation, but it has to be rooted. And then finally, on the last page, he said that's totally mistaken to think that you can separate being in itself of problems and the history, uh, uh, and two distinct worlds of objects, and being itself of history and the actual problem itself. And so he's turning to the content, and the content, it has to be meaningful to the inquirer. It has to be a real question asked by the inquirer. And I think it's beauty. It's like so. Uh, it's like you were saying. It's like Haley was saying. Like it's all, like hysterical effective consciousness is here from the very beginning. And I think that another thing I remember Grandin said that the students of Gadamer were rated as 1, 2, or 3 GADs, the level of difficulty and
Yeah.
complexity and abstractness, and this would be a very high GAD. Should have a very high GAD rating. It's a very difficult. So that's my sort of initial intuitive take on it.
Yeah. Yeah, where a GAD was like a term for a level of obscurity and
Yes,
difficulty, right? So we can
precisely.
rank them on how obscure and difficult they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, thanks, John.
So
Yeah, Eric.
does Gadamer see, like, by the end, what I had difficulty identifying is if Gadamer sees, like, the aspiration towards a system in terms of, you know, answers to questions, if that's even an aspiration that's valuable. Because he's looking at these two options, contrasting it with, like, what you were saying, John Beach, that questions are coming out of our own kind of situation, um, whereas the systems kind of come from the outside, whether it's the ahistorical problems or Hegel's teleology, that it's really about our finitude struggling with the partial truth that we are stuck with. Um, and so at that moment, it's kind of like, well, should we then just abandon aspirations towards systems, or is it just um, humbling our aspirations toward systems? But Haley, you go for it.
Thank you. So I think, Eric, I think you put this in the chat too, actually, that there's a suspicion here that system will become ahistorical, and so will no longer be situated or responsive to the particularities of a situation. I think that that's correct. I think that's a fear. And then likewise, I think the fear is that if we abandon striving for something like a system, what we lose is something like truth, um, and we become uh, maybe I don't know if this would be worldview philosophy, but we would become relativistic in our approach to meaning, and to what is. And I think actually maybe you also mentioned this, the aphoristic approach to system. He cites Friedrich Schlegel, the Romantic, right after that in the text. And so I think Gadamer is probably arguing, of course, along the same lines as Heidegger. We need a new approach um, to understanding truth as historical, but not as indexed to particular circumstances that can only give us an anti-systematicity and an aphorism. What that looks like exactly, I think I'm not entirely clear that Gadamer gives us a great answer yet, but he definitely shows the contours of the problem here. And that might actually get us, I don't want to take away from citing the text, but that might get us back to Niall's great question at the beginning about whether Gadamer is working with a Husserlian phenomenology or a Heideggerian one. And I have to admit, I didn't ask myself that question when I was working with this text. And if anyone has insight, I would love to know.
Okay, should we turn to that question? It especially came up in pages 23, 24, where in the last section where he's talking about what does the philosophical concept of truth look like now? And the idea, I assume, was if you take this systematic approach, like the idealist would, truth would have to be, fits in within the system, has its proper place within the system. And we're no longer going that route, or fits is sort of confirmed by the method. Then what is it that we want to say about truth in the place of truth? Eric.
I just wanted to ask Neil, what's the stake in it, right? What's the stake in the question of is Gadamer leaning Husserlian or not? Because I'm not trying to undermine the question. I'm trying to see if in getting at the motivation for it, we can get at the subtlety of it.
I think the passage I had in mind was there's a way of reading kind of Husserlian phenomenology as kind of idealist through and through, but there's a strong realist dimension too to Husserlian where the object is always in excess of any grasping of the object. So the stakes are quite high on that front. It would be all about, well, what is the status of the object and how does it relate to objectivity? Is objectivity something we achieve, or is objectivity in some way promised by the object? But the passage on page 23, maybe that I can just, do you mind if I refer to that? So
No, go right ahead.
So it starts with in principle, that, so it's about 10, 12 lines down. He says, in principle, after all, an entity is inexhaustible for our cognition, given the infinite fullness of its possible determinations. And that kind of gave me pause. I thought, well, you could read Husserl writing that. I don't know, David, do you agree? I mean, I just felt there was something deeply Husserlian in that statement. Mm-hmm. And then I just didn't know where. I find it difficult with Gadamer to try to, it's very dialectical. So sometimes you don't know what he's presenting as somebody else's perspective and what he's presenting as his own perspective. Yes. Because on the same page, he then moves on to language. He says, accordingly, already in terms of language, there is a noticeable inappropriateness of an expression such as this inkwell is brown and has cost a lot of money. So that for me was the only reference to language I could find. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the page, then he says, by contrast, so that same page, so always page 23, by contrast, in philosophy, the results of another research in their specific sense are only understandable by returning to the defining point of view of the other. Further, if the actual achievement of philosophy does not consist in results, as claimed initially, but in the clarification of the developments of problems, which are really gained from the things, then also the truth of philosophy must be sought out here. So we're back to the problem of truth. Mm-hmm. He's connecting it in some way to the object before he gets to the interpretation of existence. But it seems to change on page 24. And he's talking the terms that kind of non-committal interest is the term that jumped out at me in the middle of page 24. Only an entirely non-committal interest is what binds someone from today to the thought formations of the past. Now, I thought he was endorsing that. So it was hard for me to say, well, is he presenting somebody else's opinion? But as it goes on, then he talks about at the end of the page about the possibility of someone putting their own existence out of consideration. That is everyone following that? It's right at the end of page 24. Again, the very last line on page 24. So he starts talking about non-committal interest as what binds someone. I thought very phenomenological, very Husserlian, not at all Heideggerian in that sense, right? Heidegger criticizes the very possibility of suspending or the phenomenological attitude as it's understood by Husserl. And then you get this idea of putting something out of consideration. And then the last page is a rejection of that. He says, such a stance towards the history of philosophy is just as unphilosophical as the tendency to recognize one's own problems in the echo of transmitted words in all history fails to do justice to the historical uniqueness. And he talks about both attitudes. And I must admit, I was a bit confused as to what the both attitudes refers to there. The one attitude I get, the very kind of non-committal, non-participating spectator, kind of methodologically neutralized perspective. But the other attitude, what is it exactly that is the target of the... I was slightly confused. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that that's the phenomenology. I was wondering which phenomenology is at stake. Is it the hermeneutic situation phenomenology, or is it the naivety of a suspended attitude?
Especially if we read the suspended attitude, the non-committal interest as a kind of Husserlian take on it. Yeah. Greg Lynch.
Yeah, just a couple things related to what Niall was saying. I took it that when he makes the comment about the entirely non-committal interest is what binds us to the formations of the past, that's not him speaking in his own voice. I think that's him a sentence or two before he's talking about Zimmel. So I think this is what he says would follow from taking Zimmel's view of the nature of philosophy seriously. It would lead to philosophy just being this, like wandering around like, oh, interesting, some people thought that one time, and oh, look over here, some other people thought this other thing, but it's all just like completely divorced from me. And the other thing I was going to say connected to the passage you were talking about, my take on this kind of bizarre claim about, isn't it weird to say that the inkwell is brown and that it's expensive? How I took that is something like this. So that sentence is like semantically formal, logically perfectly fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here's an S and it's got two P's, right? Or two predicates. What makes that a weird thing to say is not anything about the like intrinsic meaning of the expressions. It's got to do with like the pragmatics of it, with the act of saying both of those things at the same time, because they're like, as he points out, they're completely unrelated and kind of heterogeneous to one another. It's like saying, hey, here's so and so, he's my best friend, and also he was born on a Thursday. Like that just seems that those don't have any kind of like context of relevance that binds them together. And I take it that his point is that this is the potential concern about doing the history of philosophy, that the questions and concerns that were motivating inquiry in the past are going to be different from the ones that are motivating us today because we're living in a different situation. And so simply taking those past problems or past results and kind of juxtaposing them immediately next to our own is putting together two things that belong to two different pragmatic contexts in the same way that the weird sentence about the inkwell is supposed to. Now, what further point he wants to make about that, I'm not sure, but that's what I took him to be saying with that.
So is it life philosophy versus Husserlian phenomenology? Are these
the
two
two
attitudes?
views at the end that you were talking about?
Yeah, I mean, is he if he talks with Simmel, he's obviously got this life philosophy in mind. And if he's talking about the disinterested, kind of methodologically suspended attitude, which is impossible, he's got Husserl in mind, and he's following Heidegger in between the two, right? Remember, Heidegger says somewhere that a philosophy of life is akin to saying you do a botany of plants, right? It doesn't really tell us anything about the study, right? It's simply a redundant phrase, philosophy of life. But I was a bit confused, but that's helpful. It's helpful that I felt that wasn't his position that he was endorsing, but he wasn't clear until that final page when he said it's just as unphilosophical.
Yeah. Could the two positions, this just struck me, and this might not be correct. Could the two positions be number one, well, you kind of have to put yourself in the original author's shoes to be able to make sense of anything that they're saying. So the kind of like historicist transpose yourself idea versus the kind of neutral observer just describing things from the detached third person point of view. Those are the two that are both inadequate.
Yeah, and I think the implication is around the subjectivism and relativism of the first, right? As he seems to say that one will lead to relativism or subjectivism, and the other leads to a type of what it loses the subject in some way, right? It loses sorry, not the subject, but it loses the situation. The concrete, contingent, particular is lost within that Husserlian dimension, and it's too heavily present in the other one.
Yeah, but what they both have in common is that they still kind of like detach myself and my own situation from it, right? One does it by trying to put myself in a completely different situation. The other tries to do it by pretending I have no situation at all. But both of them kind of block off the way that this problem or this question or this text addresses me as I am now in my particular situation, what seemed to be kind of the main thing Gadamer's wanting to stress the importance of here.
Yes, agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would see that as maybe not against the Lebensphilosoph, but against the Weltanschauung people who said, there is this worldview and it's sort of a self-contained worldview. We have our worldview, they have theirs, there are other ones. And to understand them doesn't mean seeing how they speak to me or address me. At no point when they take up these questions do I have to take up the question myself. In that sense, if that's what's going on, right, whether it's a first person or a third person, but simply the idea that I don't have to myself be engaged in their problems, in their questions, in their views to understand their views, then why not treat Gadamer as more on the side of Husserl, where he'd say, well, all this abstract talk, let's get to the things themselves. I mean, I saw when Gadamer's line about metaphysics having no verification, a Husserlian idea, or the problem with that compound sentence, Greg, is that you would have to look in two completely different places to know what it means to even say it, because when you get to the things, you're looking in various areas. The Husserlian idea might be, in order to make sense of this, we have to see how it speaks to me. We have to turn to the objects that it's talking about and see what we say about the objects. And it's only in the context of how it speaks to me, or it's only in the context of how what it's talking about functions for me that I can access these views. The point would be that there isn't then these holistic worldviews all separated from each other. They can only be understood through engaging them. So understanding engagement's always a possibility. I should have thought that through before I started saying that. It would have been more clear by the end. But I mean, but it is puzzling. I mean, you're right that Niall, it's hard to keep track of what he's agreeing with and what he's criticizing. I think Greg's right. The non-committal interest he's associating with Simmel. I don't know if that means he's associated with Husserl, but he's associated with Simmel.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah.
Because I thought the reference to artworks, the truth of the artwork when he talks about Simmel,
Right.
really, that seems to me a kind of receptive, participative truth, not a kind of disinterested, non-committal. That was my initial feeling, but it could be wrong-headed.
Yeah, I don't know Simmel's views. I mean, he might see artworks as expressions of cultures or something. But yeah, I'd have to know more about Simmel there. But John Beach has been waiting very patiently. John Beach, go ahead.
Well, a very fascinating discussion. And um, I'm kind of looking at it with looking down the line where like this is where by 1920, 2028, he has where he's taken this dichotomy or this sort of combining these things are inseparable and where that's leading to just go back but after I say this, but it's leading to the inseparability, the fact that you can't divorce philosophy from philology. In 1928, he's holding that, and Jean Grandin talks about that. But in the question for me, that means, I mean, that's to me, that's he's referring to. Gadamer always says that if philosophy has to do with questions and aporia or problems, whatever, we have to ask that. We have to ask that and put our own thoughts at use. I mean, it's always the translation of a text, and he's talking about the being in itself, and he says in Being in Time that the text has no meaning in itself. Okay, you gotta hold on to that, and it's only the this is why lots of people like the contemporary classicists can't read Gadamer because of this. But um, the I think the being in itself of the history and it's not a being in itself, and the being of itself as of the problem are not true being in itself. They cannot be separated, and that's where so he's taken, I think, all this up to now to get there, and the systems, sort of cuts you off because he says this earlier, because you start with a system, you've already sort of, it contains your answer. You just have to fit everything else into it. But then on the other hand, there's still some meaning to system that you cannot, like Aristotle and Kant has, like he talks about the categories and so on. He says, well, I took these from Aristotle, but then the way Aristotle's principles are related and are grounded in language and the way we speak is totally different. It's very free. It's very sort of and I see Gadamer as doing that. I see Gadamer as just going back into what the language actually comes out of. I think this whole thing is just implicitly, in a way, he doesn't speak about language. Of course, the Greeks had no concept of what language of language. They didn't talk about it as conceptually, but it is a sort of a he's doing what he did even in Truth and Method and Forever, is he's drawing his ideas out of his turning these things over and over, and it's a dialectic that's happening within his own mind. But I think he reaches that the fact that his relation to philosophy and or history and philosophical problems are are beyond Delphi, something that Delphi idea of historicity could not comprehend. So I guess there's my end.
Yeah.
Your end is
No,
my
thanks,
lesson.
No, I think you really can see the seeds of his later thought right in here.
Yeah.
See, you bring in the Greeks, you bring in language, that you're really gonna start to see the full Gadamer picture.
And one more little thing. In Aristotle, the foundation, the arche, it only comes at the end of the investigation. Doesn't come at it's not a foundational, it's not so that's where he says Aristotle turns things upside down, or Heidegger said that. No, he says that Heidegger turns things, because Heidegger goes back to Aristotle. And I think Heidegger may be a bit disturbed here, because here he's trying to grasp Aristotle in a way that's quite independent of the way that Heidegger himself grasped it in the 23 seminar. Mm-hmm. And he's formulating his own view. So I think that would have been a bit disturbing for Heidegger.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. No, fair enough. Greg Lynch.
I was just going to say, Dave, with your question before, it strikes me as relevant to the question. I don't know how relevant this is to the text itself, that there's an important difference between Husserl on like direct and indirect discourse, right? So when Husserl, when we're doing philosophy ourselves, our focus should be on the things themselves,
Hmm.
not on our kind of like preconceptions about them. And it seems clear that Gadamer is all on board with that part of Husserl, as I think
Yeah.
Heidegger is too. But then when it comes to Husserl on like interpreting or how we relate to the thoughts and words of other people, if I remember right, and you
Right.
probably know Husserl on this better than me, there's this idea that like when the other person says the cat is on the mat, and
Hmm.
I hear that, I kind of like put quotation marks around it. And I intend it not simply as the cat's being on the mat, but as David says that, or David thinks that the
Sure.
cat is on the mat. And I'm therefore kind of like relativizing it to your
Hmm.
perspective and your framework, which that then sounds a lot more like the kind of historicisty picture, the worldviewsy picture maybe
I
than
see.
than Husserl's first order stuff would be. Is that number one, is that correct about Husserl? And number two, does that make a difference here?
I think that's probably correct, but I don't know that's the whole story because our intersubjective we share an intersubjective world, and so claims you make about the cat being on the mat are going to be relevant for me, even if you say the cat is on the mat, and I think, oh, Greg thinks there's a cat on the mat. This exists in a certain independent intersubjective space that can function to confirm or disconfirm my own beliefs about cats and mats and experiences.
I think that's right. I guess my point was more about, right. So you're trying to understand what exactly have I asserted when I say that the cat is on the mat? What
Mm.
have I said? That
Yeah.
you're going to figure that out not by relating that sentence to your own situation
Right.
and framework, but by relating it to mine.
Yes.
And then you can ask the further question about whether what I said corroborates or contradicts something that you yourself believe.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yep.
Thanks.
Fair enough. I thought we might look at a quote on page 20 where he seems to preserve the idea of uh, the systematic thinking, the systematic moment, the venture. He uses that word quite a bit. Um, I didn't look up the German, but the you get at the top of 20, he talks about metaphysical assumptions that always go beyond what is truly verifiable. And then in a long paragraph, he talks about, I don't know, a little over halfway through a paragraph says, the venture in one's own research cannot be the examination of metaphysical claims demanded by one's own set of problems, but resides at a deeper level, returning to the factual grounds of one's own problems first enables the possibility of the treatment of one's problems, as well as the possibility of understanding and criticizing the problems present in history. So, in order to understand, and then once you understand, are able to criticize the problems present in history, you do that by returning to the factual grounds of one's own problems, which enable the possibility of the treatment of one's problems. Also, and maybe we need to cash all that out. Also, in this way, the systematic moment is not shut off, but is not simply determined in terms of the state of problems, which is historically transmitted. The state is historically transmitted. The systematic moment lies in the engagement with the things themselves, which must be gained in each case. Such an engagement is not simply the exercise of a factually undetermined acumen on given and received material of a problem, but rather it is achievement of a primordial relation to things in the increasing precariousness of one's own existence. And then he says, the encouragement with all problems which concern this existence necessarily has a systematic structure because one's own existence is unitary, so that no moment can be imagined away and nothing can be incorporated into it which does not lie in it. So there's a lot of senses there, and each one makes sort of a claim. But yeah, go ahead.
I'm glad you pointed this out. I really like this passage too. And it made me think, I don't know if anyone had this sense, but that kind of the missing concept not included here or mentioned is contemporaneity.
Mm.
I kind of got that sense from exactly this part of the text that you're mentioning now. He even says close to the top the specific term lingering, and isn't that related to are the same the same term as tearing,
Oh, maybe. Yeah, I don't know.
tearing and
Ask the
lingering,
translator.
and
Yeah,
um,
but I like that point. I think one fun thing we could do with the text is say what terms are missing. And everyone, you know what?
yeah,
If he would have write this 40 years later, he would have added
yeah.
systematicity or contemporaneity at that point, right?
Well, he actually juxtaposes it to at the top, systematic ambition versus lingering.
Yeah,
Um, at that first like half of the first paragraph on that page 20.
yeah.
Um,
So
and he calls
what do
it
you make about him saying that there is this that existence necessarily has a systematic structure, or that there still is a systematic venture that can't be
yeah,
put
it's
away?
almost well, he also calls it open tension, and you're supposed to kind of keep it open or endure it. Which to me, I kept thinking of contemporaneity because it's
Hmm.
like maintaining the historical moment of yourself as well as the object. Um, but it's weird to me that he doesn't use that term at all here, but it is kind of early, right? In his the yeah.
I oh, Abdullah, you've got something there? Abdullah's got the Heidegger text in front of him. Abdullah, you want to join in here?
Yeah, sorry, sorry about that. Yeah, Heidegger uses this Verweilen thinking and mentions a couple of times in the lecture, and Gadamer was the participant of the lecture. Even in the introduction, Haley was mentioning this, and I just wanted to at this point to
Yeah.
I don't know what your name is. Sorry. Yeah, yeah,
Michael.
Michael. Yeah,
Yeah.
to my point.
Yeah, so the concept was out there. Gadamer would have been familiar with it,
Yeah.
and Michael, you picked it up with the lingering there, right? Does it make sense to still talk about something being systematic then? If it's just a lingering with something, a tearing, something, a kind of openness, why still emphasize the systematic character? Why make this move at the end where he says it's going to be systematic because our existence is unitary. So everything will be united in us. And so we'll have this sort of systematic character by default just because of the kind of creatures we are. Greg.
Oh, I was just going to say the very thing you just said. I mean, I took it that was the point he was trying to make, that for something to be system.
Well, so much for that point, Greg.
Sorry, did I just disappear? My thing just crashed
Yes, you
on.
did.
I undis. Yeah, for something to be systematic just is for it to be kind of organized around some central unifying theme. And he's trying to say, yeah, no, understanding is organized in that way, but the central theme is not some abstract concept. It's like me in my own life, in my own situation. So there is a kind of systematicity to the things we discover in philosophy aren't just going to be like kind of random disconnected factoids. They're all going to orbit around a common center, so to speak. But that common center is my life and my existence and the questions that it poses. That's at least what I took him to be saying. But then you said the very same thing. So David was.
Yeah, but I said it was skepticism. You said it was
Well, right, right.
openness.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's like why the thing I just said seems like that makes sense to me. That's a thing someone might say.
Yeah.
What's the source of the skepticism in your recounting of it?
Well, I guess I'm not sure I experienced my own life as systematic as I. Maybe there's a deep-seated systematicity that I'm just not always fully aware of, or maybe I feel like I could engage things in a much more systematic spirit. Um, and I also don't think that if I just sort of followed things that struck me, if I made a point of saying, yeah, I don't. I guess that's my first thought is that it's a different sense of systematic than you often see in philosophical thought, where if someone said, did it work systematic? I would think, does it hang together in a kind of coherent way where you'd see the connections among these various projects and questions and I'm not sure I've made a point of doing that, though you would say yes, but it's all you. So it must have some sort of unity there because they're all things that occurred to you at some point to wonder about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I took it that he was expressly trying to kind of say, well, philosophy is not going to have the kind of systematicity that we normally think, but there is this other still real and genuine kind of systematicity, kind of existential systematicity or
Right.
something that it will possess. So it's not just random disconnected stuff.
Yep. Fair enough. Fair enough. John Beach.
Yeah, I agree with all of this. And I think that I, I go back to the beginning of this thing, and where he says that um, every question in philosophy, or the method, must come from the thing itself.
Mm-hmm.
We learn each object has its own method that develops, which is Aristotle, and use of methodos, and the this is the thing is we do like system, like in Plato, in the Phaedo he calls it hypothesis, but this is it's like a presupposition. It's sort of, and Aristotle will call it like a point of view, like a principle, or it's like a Kantian sort of um, um, anyway. Anyway, I won't get into that, but the it's we do have points of views that are related, but the thing is to ground them. Like, look, we don't start out with them. The thing is that with the object, the explanation of the object involves, coming to the arche of that's where that point of view originates from, that system comes from. In each case, as it relates, and each object will sort of give us a different type of configuration of systems and so on. I think that's behind Gadamer's thinking here.
Okay. Yeah.
And he uses the word system, which he does not use later because it's too many. So it's overburdened with all these prejudices and stuff. But
Right.
yeah, so I think we're all on the right track here, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Yes, Michael.
There was another place where I also had that sense that contemporaneity was in play. And it's also a part where I know someone else mentioned um, Gadamer's view of the classical, and he talks about Plato there, so it might be helpful. It's on page 14,
Okay.
um,
Yeah,
where he
Shaba
talks
brought that
about
up at the beginning.
the Platonic contents, and he says, for instance, simply interpreting Platonic problems in such a way that they express the investigation of the problems of our days means to renounce from the outset grasping completely the Platonic contents and to make Plato an undifferentiated predecessor of our present.
Yeah.
So to me, that was saying that you want to keep the identities of both participants, of subject and object differentiated rather than kind of collapsing them together, right? And that's kind of
Right.
what contemporaneity speaks to me is that you are in that you maintain a relationship, but you're still maintaining the identity of both sides.
Okay.
Um,
Without collapsing one into the other,
and yeah, exactly.
right? Without making Plato just some ancient commentator on contemporary events,
Yeah,
right? We
and
both, yeah.
yeah, is that the stock of problems too that he talks about? That where he meant he I think he critiques the idea of like having a stock of problems.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, we still have to get back to Chavez' question in the beginning, but I think what he's critiquing is the idea that we can, well, like Eric said, when you teach history of philosophy, say we have a whole class on the free will debate, and start reading person after person. What does Plato say about free will? What does Augustus say about free will? As if they're all addressing the same question. And we have a stock of problems. What is reality? What is knowledge? What is truth? What is free will? And then we just line up the philosophers and put their views as if they're talking about the same thing. All right. So that would be the stock of, and he thinks that's just sort of sloppy, sloppy historical work, right? Not taking seriously the ways in which these questions arise in different contexts and have different meanings. Does that make sense?
so the subject matter would be what's intermediated between the two.
I think Gadamer thinks we need a much more sophisticated way of reading. When we read the Stoics on freedom, we are not just thinking they are asking the same questions we're asking, and we're not just consigning them to here's what people thought about freedom back in that time, but we are allowing our own concrete questions about freedom to come to the table and see the ways in which those questions are revised or changed or inspired or transformed in reading the Stoics and how they formulate these problems in ways similar or different than ours. Something like that, I would say,
Yeah.
is what's going on. Niall.
I wanted to come back to the tarrying question because
Yeah.
I think it's key. I mean, what would be the difference between a systematic approach, David? So you mentioned a kind of a systematic approach to one's own life as opposed to a tarrying approach, right?
Mm.
Because it seems very clear the translation of lingering sometimes makes it sound kind of a bit flippant, right? I just lingering with something for the moment, where tarrying has a sense of attentiveness. It has a sense of a kind of a bearing. Like I'm doing something when I'm tarrying with a problem. It's not just flippantly thinking about something or being waylaid by something, but I'm held. And in this 1923 lectures by Heidegger, he talks very much in terms of Sichhalten. So he talks about taking a position on something, a type of attentiveness to a problem, which I think it's important to talk about in terms of he sees that as an authentic attitude already on the way. Like, so to tarry with something is the opposite to fleeing from something.
Mm.
So I think the tarrying element there is about not being on the run from something. So a systematic understanding of one's own life could in fact be a fleeing from one's own life.
Mm-hmm.
If I give a systematic kind of unified account of myself, it might not be an authentic account of myself, but if I am kind of seized by my own self in the most positive sense, right? Or held by my own existence
Mm-hmm.
or faced with my own existence, I tarry with it in a sense. I don't need to explain it away. So a systematic account might try to explain away the problematicity of my own life. So is
Right.
that a helpful way? Like systematicity. By the way, all of the neo-Kantians, they all wrote 3 books. They all wrote, like Kant, they followed, that's a very systematic account. They need
Yeah.
one about epistemology, one on morals, one on aesthetics. So Cohen, Natorp, they all wrote trilogies,
Yeah.
which is this very embodiment. David, you said you like examples. It's the very embodiment of a systematic approach to a problem.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. I can see that. And I can see too, if the focus is on how to do the history of philosophy, to have a systematic approach would be to set out from the start. This is what we're going to do. We're going to see how we have a set of problems. We have ethics, epistemology, aesthetics, right? And we're going to see what they have to say about these things. And that's how we're going to understand history of philosophy. Maybe we're going to talk about it as a great movement toward Hegel or what have you, as opposed to tearing with the texts, right, from the start and using that as a starting point. I wanted to return to Shaba's question at the very start about um, the problems approach to philosophy. Shaba, do you want to restate your question again and reorient us to that central theme of the paper?
Uh, okay, so I just repeat my my first remarks. It is somehow perplexing to read that the unsolvability of the problems or the undecidability of the problems should be somehow a mark of philosophical character, relevance, or whatever. Uh, Whereas I'm deeply convinced that both Gadamer and Heidegger were attempting to find questions to find answers to questions they were they were involved with. Okay, so it is simply provocative. This, I think, overstatement of the unsolvability of the problems. We all are interested in solutions or results that perhaps are not final, but for us they represent what we think to be the best, and we participate in debates and exchange of or confrontation of positions in favor of such views. So that's simply a tangent. It might well be that it is simply an overstatement of the historicity or historicality of the philosophical problems, where Gadamer is engaged here in criticizing the history of problem, neo-Kantian history of problem approach. It might.
Let me just point out, you're talking about page 11, for those of you who are looking around. This is where he talks about the insolvability of the problem shows their philosophical valence. And the philosophical attitude lies exactly in enduring the undecidability and open uncertainty of the problem, right? When your point is actually they're often trying to solve problems. That's part of the goal, part of the point is to try to solve these problems, not just to sort of endure their undecidability. Right, Shamba?
Yeah, of
Yeah, I
course.
just want
When
people to see what you're referring to.
there's perhaps a proposal to treat this tension if we say that in every uh, philosophical problem in the history of philosophy, we have the option to approach it with an eye on the historical context as a problem for a history of ideas, and on the other hand, perhaps we can approach it with a rather systematic interest, and then we we ask what we can learn from this. Platonic, Cartesian, or whatever, or scholastic proposal to solve a problem. We will have serious problems of translation, or we will have also problems whether we have an adequate vocabulary to reformulate or to integrate those problems. Just to mention a serious problem, the problem of individuality. It is a question. It is a debate, a huge debate in medieval and ancient
Right.
history of philosophy, whether we can reasonably talk about individuality in somewhat Christian accentuated sense of the term as we are accustomed to use it. For example, before Augustine, or in Greek philosophy, and so on and so on. But that's, I mean, that's special. I mean, that's a question that can make us sensible to problems of translation. But you can of course say that if you investigate with the glasses or with perspective of the history of ideas, then you are not really interested in the answers. Let me give here an example. The for the 18th century, it's a fundamental question whether God and the evil and the existence of evil can be somehow harmonized or put in any reasonable relationship. And I'm relatively so the German philosopher Odo Marquardt wrote a lot about this whole broad bunch of questions, but so it is simply not really an urgent question for the 20th or even the 21st century, I would say. So there are such changes in background convictions, and this problem clearly shows that you might have a case when you not really have systematic interests, but you might be interested in a topic for reasons and interest in intellectual history.
Right. No, that's great. I was thinking you gave an example of individuation, and I was thinking of the medieval question of I was thinking exactly the same lines, question of how many angels there are, which was a huge debate because angels are immaterial, and if matter is what individuates, then there can only be one angel. So each angel is its own species, in which case, so went on for centuries, right? Trying to figure out, and it was a crucial thing, and all these different, and you could be interested in it just out of curiosity, and they see how the Thomists would answer it and how Scotus would answer it, and but they aren't things that speak to me. I don't lay awake at night wondering about this. It has no impact on my life at all, except as a certain sort of matter of intellectual curiosity. And this is the sort of thing you're talking about, right? That how does Gadamer explain this phenomena? You don't want to say that we're incapable of understanding their views if they don't have any impact on us, but he seems to suggest that what matters is this existential import. We need to have
I
a stake
think
in it.
if I could just interject here, I've
Yeah,
been thinking about this for a while. What is a question? What is the question for us? What is the most pressing philosophical question for us today? And I think Gadamer hints about this throughout. And um, you know, uh, Heidegger, what is called thinking? In other words, what does thinking
mm,
call us to think? What is the subject matter of philosophy for us? What is the philosophical question for us now in this time, right?
yeah,
Well, what John Arthos was talking about, what is wrong what is misconceived about our relationship to being or to nature as such, and our self-understanding that we're going to destroy everything, and that destruction is accelerating. There's no sign that we're going to stop it.
mm,
That is a philosophical. So that is a philosophical question that is present and contemporaneous, if you want to call it. But it's meaningful, and it means something, and we are called upon to ask it as
yeah,
philosophers. And so there's an example of contempt. It has nothing to do with, and this is what this is why I think the Greeks are so important to Gadamer, indispensable, because they had it was a totally different understanding of the subject, the modern subject that controls everything, that decides the truth in the matter. The Cartesian did not exist then. There was no, as Heidegger said, there were no objects before Descartes. This sort of objectification, this domination of nature. Like, how do we break that if we're going to survive for very
yeah,
much longer? I think that's a philosophical question.
yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I think
I'm ranting.
one thing Gadamer does later on that he doesn't do here, he talks about problems, later he talks about questions. And one thing he wants to say is you can't really ask a question without engaging a question, right? And
Mhm.
when you want to read someone of history of philosophy, you want to find out what their questions are. You
Mhm.
understand them as answering questions, and those questions are things that are meant to trigger curiosity or interest to speak to you, that you get drawn into. And in
Yeah,
that,
we have to ask it ourselves. We have
yeah,
to risk. we have to put ourselves on the line and try to, in a sort of a fusion of horizon sort of way, but to grasp it and ask it, or otherwise that philosophy has no meaning for us. It doesn't have anything. We'd have nothing to learn from it.
Well, I'm not sure I'm ever risking myself very much by doing my philosophy.
Well, then
But
you're not, according to Gadamer, you wouldn't be doing it right then.
yeah, well, that's probably true. I believe
That's what he
that.
says.
Michael,
I
did
don't
you want
know.
to get in here?
No, yeah, no, I was just going to say in Truth of Method, he talks about there's a difference between posing a question and risking a
Yeah.
question. And that speaks, yeah, exactly to that. If you're not seriously contending with it yourself, then it's not achieving its like full purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. Greg.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think that the kind of, existential risking dimension of this doesn't necessarily imply that, like when I read the first critique, I've got to be, wrestling with, the
Yeah.
fundamental questions of my being and stuff like that. I take it that his point about questions has to do with like what he thinks the intentionality of questions is, that questions are not just kind of like related to these abstract propositions that are possible. And he thinks that a question discloses some subject matter in its possibility. So here are ways that the things might be, which kind of belong to the being of the thing in some way. Because this is the thing that it is, it could be like this, it could be like that. And because questioning is a matter of recognizing these possibilities, yeah, he says you can't pose a question without asking it yourself, because I have to see that possibility and see that it is in fact possible for me to be engaging with the object that the question discloses at all. That doesn't have to mean, is my life worth living? Should I break up with my girlfriend or something like that? It could be more mundane things, but they're possibilities that are possibilities for me. These are things that I could, in fact, recognize as possible. As opposed to he talks about like dead questions like perpetual motion.
Yeah.
Like I just can no longer see that as a possibility of the thing.
So do you think that talking about questions in that way is fundamentally different than talking about problems? So
Yeah, I
problems
think
doesn't have that same sort of character to it.
I think so. Yeah, so I think that the point is that as he's thinking about problems, problems are kind of defined formally or kind of defined in terms of certain propositions rather than defined in terms of Zaken, in terms of subject matters.
Mm-hmm.
And so problems have this kind of absolute identity across time, or at least so the proponents of this view say,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is freedom compatible with determinism, right? Where freedom has a kind of set, settled meaning, determinism has a kind of set, settled meaning, and there's just the question about the relation of these two propositions. Whereas Gadamer wants to say, no, questioning, right? Questions are rooted in things as they show themselves to concrete individuals, and of course, those things are going to show themselves differently to each individual. So I take it that that's the difference there.
Okay. Good. Yes, Niall.
There is a very nice reference at the beginning of the 1923 ontology, The Hermeneutics of Facticity. He said, questioning is to be contrasted with the industry of problems. And he says the industry of problems is bent on abolishing questioning. So it's a very, very strong claim and I think that's connected to systematicity, right? The whole question of systematicity could be the suppression of the questionability of philosophical thinking itself. There's some deeper suppression or oblivion of that deeper sense of questioning that maybe a history of problems wants to not abolish, but at least to sideline or.
I just wanted to add one point to that too, that Gadamer is trying to get us to break out of this prison of epistemology that we are trapped in, that is leading to our end. And the only way you can do that is to engage in philosophical thinking. Philosophical thinking does not know where it's going to end up. You have to ask the question so you don't know what the answer is. This is he said, if you're if you're thinking something, if you think that you're thinking philosophically and it's kind of predetermined, you're not thinking philosophically at all. You have to. This is what we're trying to say. It's like that's where the risk part comes in, because you don't know what the answer is going to be, and if you can't do that, then you're not thinking philosophically. You're thinking epistemologically, and as Heidegger says, epistemology is metaphysics that has lost its way.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, that's it.
So,
Michael.
So is his critique then just then with the idea of like a finality to the problems or questions ultimately being solved for the rest of the time? He's just critiquing that idea with coming back to the passage we were looking at.
Yeah, sure. Like there's no eternal truth. There's no solving of anything. There's no ending Hamas for all time. That's another word for genocide. But no, there's no yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So systematicity would be like, okay, we found this little aspect out is verifiably true, so we could fit it in with the rest. Whereas philosophical thinking would be like, no, everything's always in fluid or like able to be amended or however you want to call it.
Well, it is. It's asking. We're always within certain perspectives, certain systems. If you like Aristotle has like the doctrine of the four causes. Well, that's just a framework of different points of view you can apply to something. We wrongly think it explains what he means by physis. Heidegger knows that's wrong, so does Gadamer. But that's how we interpret Aristotle today. We all do. It's wrong. But anyway, the asking of the question is, I mean, all of this is well, Gadamer. It's like there's an openness, but there are answers, but they're not eternal answers. They're finite. They're sort of things that satisfy us, that we feel right about, that we can come to an agreement on, and as far as we can go. Sure. Yeah.
Here's what I thought. I mean, Greg had this example of free will and determinism. And I thought one way in which this systematicity or focus on problems affects the way you do history of philosophy. We've got a whole bunch of theories about free will. And then we look at Hume and we say, oh, Hume's a compatibilist. I've got my arguments against compatibilism. I don't actually have to read Hume or struggle with him or try to figure out what he's struggling with or any of those sorts of things. I have my system. I have my approaches, my method. I'm ready to go. And now it's just a matter of figuring out which block these figures fit into. Does that make sense? And that eliminates thinking, right? That's what Niall was saying. This takes the place of thinking.
Yeah.
This
I agree with all
classifying
that.
takes the place of thinking.
Yeah.
Now,
Absolutely.
does that example make sense of what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I think it's precisely that. But I think with the understated role of language in this essay, it's somewhat problematic because I think he connects the break with Heidegger, I think, is around the role of language, that there isn't a language of metaphysics, right? That I think so. So he does believe that metaphysics implies systematicity, but he also feels that when we reflect on the phenomenon of language or the essence of language or the nature of language, we can in some way unfreeze. He uses a render fluid again, make fluid again philosophical thinking. So I think when he thinks about language, he thinks about it differently from Heidegger. And he says there is no language of metaphysics, there are metaphysical concepts. And the metaphysical concepts are the kind of, in some way, possibly the rigidification of the problems.
Yeah.
But if we think about language differently, we can unfreeze those frozen concepts.
Okay. We think of
But
language.
since he doesn't have language in this essay yet, he's on the way to thinking about that third part of truth and method, about the ontological turn guided by language, right? That's
right.
Not present in this essay. But yeah, that exactly what you said sounds spot on.
So, Eric, I tried to work our way to your problems versus questions that you brought up at the beginning.
Yeah, no, I heard it. But I want to stick with this like tension in like different theories of language, because not just the history of philosophy with the Neo-Kantians, these sorts of things. It's also our, like, to me, it's a human propensity to, like, you take an intro to psychology class and you're like, oh, I have that. Oh, I have that. Right? Like you're learning these new categories and you're like, yes, I have that. Or all the the plethora of sexual orientation identity categories now, like whatever. What's the one where you're only attracted to minds or something? I don't even know. But this propensity is not just a philosophical problem. It seems to be a human problem, and it's connected with our like now saying this view of language. How does language work? Is it about uh I'm thinking of recur here, the reproductive quality of language that I represent the world, or is it more like what Gadamer promotes, this kind of language is about disclosing the being there, not the correctly labeling the thing that's there. So when I'm saying, is Descartes a rationalist or an empiricist? It's like, okay, thanks for the trivial thing. Going back to John Beach saying that's not philosophizing. To go, well, what category? And anyway, now I'm just getting on a soapbox about like case studies and whatever. Intro to ethics classes where it's like, how would a deontologist respond to the trolley problem?
Right. Right. Yep. It's true.
But those are questions that people ask.
Yeah.
But they are questions in the problem sense of questions, not questions in the sense of something arising from my situatedness with regard to subject matters.
Right. Yes. We hope that the trolley problem never arose out of your situatedness from the subject matter. You never
But
found
when
yourself in this position and thinking,
Yeah, but to me, that's how to humanize the trolley problem, is to go, no, really, what would you do in that situation? It's not about like what would a deontologist do? It would be holy shit. Well, whatever. Anyway.
anyway. Haley, I want to come back to you. Since you know this, you spent more time with this text than any of us.
Hmm.
Are there parts of this that you feel like, oh, there was this great part in the middle here we haven't even talked about yet? Or one of the things I really wanted to hear people talk about that I struggled with was this part here in this section, or my favorite part was,
Yeah, sure. I mean, you are putting me on the spot a little
yeah,
bit,
I know, sorry, I was gonna
David,
try to give
but
you a heads up.
mostly because I'm so like um sorry, this will sound corny, but I'm so happy at all the things that you all pointed out that I didn't kind of latch onto in the beginning, or in the beginning when I read this text initially. But let's see. Well, I don't know. I guess one thing we didn't really talk about too much is the engagement with Hegel,
Right.
which it takes up a significant portion of the text.
Yeah.
So in what way is Hegelian system or systematics, in what way is that being criticized here or not? Is there a lingering Hegelian commitment that Gadamer takes to the end? I guess that's the only thing I think we really should discuss. And I guess that's probably part two, right? Where he talks about most of that.
Yep. Yeah, I was thinking on page 17.
Yep. There's a
I mean, he
dubiousness.
gives two of the most classic criticisms of Hegel, right? One is Hegel's philosophy of nature. You can see sort of Schelling's waiting there. And one is
Mhm.
Hegel's problem, the problem of individuality. And there's Kierkegaard. So I feel like he's picked two main figures in the history tradition to and is repeating their criticisms, but connecting it to this idea of a system. But yeah, let's look at that. It's on page 17 and 18. And Shaba, when you brought up the problem of medieval problem of individuality, I was reminded that he hits Hegel on this question about whether he can make sense of an individual. And Hegel might say there is no sense to be made of an individual. Um, but Hegel's one of the models of a system. I don't know what the Neo-Kantians thought about Hegel. Frankly, if anyone knows about some neo-Kantianism. Um,
Well, I
yeah,
only kind of know of this from a discussion via email with Steve Kroll.
sure.
Frito and I sent him our introduction. We're like, did we get anything wrong about neo-Kantians? Because, no one really teaches the neo-Kantians anymore.
Right.
And his suggestion was that, well, at a certain point, and this is in his book on the normativity book in phenomenology, the neo-Kantians eventually could be understood as neo-Hegelians,
Mhm.
in part because of their incorporation of history.
Right.
But I only know that from conversation. I haven't read all of the texts.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, Michael?
Um, as far as what he um what he also agrees with Hegel on the earlier page on 15, I thought it was interesting. Um, there's a sentence that says the problem, however, by being uniquely assigned to someone does not lose anything of its actual philosophical objectivity and absoluteness.
Mm.
I thought it was interesting that he still maintains obviously the idea of the absolute is usually attached with Hegel, but he for in some capacity thinks that absoluteness still maintains with this idea of questioning and problems.
Yeah, because I mean, I think he wants to say that if it's a specific existential problem related to you, if it doesn't have something bigger than you, then it just becomes relativistic, right? So it needs to be something more. Absolute's a strong word, but you're right. He's got to say that connects to this Hegel idea, right? Yeah,
Mhm.
I think you're right. Yeah, Chaba.
I would protest against the characterization of neo-Kantians as Hegelians because, I mean, the whole movement is described as moving back to Kant in the name of a scientific philosophy, and that's clearly directed against Hegel. And I mean. We are at the end of the 19th century, and German idealism was broken down at the latest in the middle of the century with a fierce critique of scientifically, empirically, psychologically oriented movements. So neo-Kantians understood what they were doing as as a re-establishment of science and scientific philosophy, totally in a parallel with neo-positivism. They were less critical to classical metaphysics, and I mean what the Marburg school, because so it's not it's only the Marburg school that was interested in history of philosophy. I mean that's also a fundamental change in the approach to the history of philosophy, because as Gadamer and also Heidegger emphasized, for Hegel, the history of philosophy was the development of subsequent intellectual steps, but and the unity of the history of philosophy, the logical development that one can from the absolute perspective grasp in this movement, but sorry, but for the history of problems approach, the only unity of the history of philosophy is is the set of eternal problems and nothing else. The answers may vary as they want. The unity of the history of philosophy is described in a very different and much less historical way as in Hegel. So I think that these are reasons for separate neo-Kantians much more from a Hegel-like approach, and from a very strong Hegelian idea of the system
Mhm.
in this context.
Yeah, fair enough. I always wondered about Cassirer, right? That Gadamer never seems to talk about him, though they would have been contemporaries. He's sort of the last of the Marburg neo-Kantians, the one who seems to be most focused on working historically in the history of philosophy. And it seems to be a conspicuous absence. And I mean, neo and so I mean, Grondon talk other people talk about this that neo-Kantian references sort of fall out of Gadamer altogether as if he doesn't want to talk about that any longer. But he always struck me as a conversation partner that never shows up in his writings. I mean, I don't know that Gadamer ever talks about that Davos moment between Heidegger and Cassirer, but at any rate, I think you're right, Shaba. Is more that there are Hegelian themes that the neo-Kantians were pushing back against and wanted to make sure they were clearly not endorsing. Eric.
I wanted to continue on this reference with that Haley brought up, like to what degree is Gadamer engaging Hegel, and I think it's on page 19 where I'm starting to read Gadamer as saying the problem that Hegel has is that he's so addicted to system that he ends up distorting particulars. So, right, like these particulars can only fit the system in this way, and so that's what the particular is, and that's Gadamer's right. You're not really listening to the particular. Um, so I was reading it that way.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the criticisms, right? Once we have the system, now everything must be put into it somewhere.
Yes.
And it's just a matter of figuring out where it fits the system, not actually paying attention to what might be individual in the expression. Niall?
I was wondering about that reference to Hegel, where Gadamer seems to be disagreeing. Hegel says the truth is the whole, right?
Yeah.
And there is a reference on page 8. Gadamer says, truth does not lie in a closed and total system. In contrast to Hegel's statement in the Phenomenology, the true is not the whole. Instead, truth is to be found in the proximity of philosophical problems to their factual origin, which is bound to the particular philosopher. Oh, sorry, that is in. Sorry, I've totally misunderstood. That is in the introduction. So maybe Haley is in a better position to speak to that. But so,
I
what
think
would
he says
Gadamer,
that. He says that in the text too.
so, but what would Gadamer's version be then? If the truth is not the whole, I mean, there's a famous Adorno inversion of this. Adorno says that the truth, the whole is untruth. He says, right? I don't think Gadamer would go that far, but I'm wondering what Gadamer's version of that Hegelian phrase would be.
Would it be? Doesn't he have a idea of? I think it's the anticipation of completeness.
Mm-hmm.
I think that might speak to that. So it's a forever engaging process. You're always anticipating completeness, but it's never finalized.
Sorry for intervening. Vorgriff der Vollkommenheit and the anticipation of completeness refers not to the totality of everything around us, but it refers to the completeness of the text or whatever we want to understand. And I mean, it's sometimes it's put in parallel to the Donald Davidson's principle of charity, and I simply don't think that Gadamer would have any similar idea to Hegel's idea of the truth being the whole, because Gadamer simply doesn't think that we can reasonably grasp a whole in a similar way as Hegel attempted to do it. And I mean, you Neil, you refer to Adorno's famous Das Wahre, das Ganze ist das Unwahre, as a refusal of a totalizing approach which suppresses everything individual and so on and so on. I think Gadamer would probably have similar complaints against such a Hegelian view. And if we look at what he's doing in Truth and Method, then Gadamer simply the cuts of the idea of historicity and historical embeddedness from Hegel's speculative philosophy of the absolute, and Gadamer underlines that he's doing so.
But even in Truth and Method, there's a strong commitment to das Ganze, right? He does seem to say that the whole needs to pre-delineate questioning, or the promise of the whole so I mean, I don't know if the whole needs to be interpreted directly in terms of Vollkommenheit, in terms of perfection. It could be completeness, it could be the anticipation of completeness, as Michael was saying, or the promise of a fulfillment is itself what keeps the conversation going. So you must have some sort of weak concept of wholeness without all of the metaphysical claims that might accompany that.
Yeah, but it's not the totality of the universe. What is attempted in Hegel? I mean, that's a fundamental.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yes,
that's only what I wanted to underline.
Yeah, he says it's never in the text. He says it's never perfect wholeness. He says though never in such a way that it ever appears in perfect wholeness. So that's
Yeah.
it speaks to that.
The line from the introduction, maybe this is where Greg's going to go, is on page 24 is where you get what he says about truth. Greg, is this what you were going to talk about, or did you have something else?
Not explicitly, but maybe which passage do
So
you
at the
have in
top,
mind?
he says, a single approach to problems, about 5 sentences down, cannot itself be false or true in a primary sense. Rather, problems which emerge from a primordial and personal relationship to things are true. The more radical this relationship is, the closer the development of problems gets to the sense of objective truth. So this is this existential idea of sort of the personal connection to the problems is what it is that allows us to speak of them being true. Maybe in a sense, I think of like William James's sense of this is a live option, or this is a true question for me. This is a true issue I'm struggling with, something like that.
One little thing we should remember is that the primary way that Gadamer distinguishes philosophy from science is that science cannot deal with the whole, whereas philosophy does.
Yeah.
David, would you say that the concept of objectivity then is something that's achieved intersubjectively, interpersonally, dialogically for Gadamer? Is objectivity itself something that's accomplished in that Husserlian?
I would eventually, there's nothing about dialogue here.
Yeah.
We're talking about the missing concepts in 1924. I think at this point, it is just this idea that it speaks to us. It arises out of our existential situation. It speaks to us.
Right.
But ideally, yeah, it should be dialogue. We're nearing the end. Greg, you ready? This is the time where I ask if there's things that you've wanted to talk about that you haven't had a chance to. Greg, you had your hand up?
It's all right. We're near the end here. I'll just say I agree very much with what Java said about wholeness. There's holes that are given in our finite experience, and Gadamer's all for those. You have to interpret the part in light of that whole. And then there's the whole that is the whole of reality that could only be the object of a non-situated kind of understanding. And Gadamer says, not eventually, whether and I think that here, Gadamer, I think thinks that that's not just unattainable for us, but that that's an incoherent idea.
Yeah.
That sort of whole.
I just want to thank Haley for translating this because it's kind of blowing me away.
Thank you, Haley.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you guys read it. It's really cool. I'm gonna immediately send my co-translator like all the notes I took because this was really fruitful. So thanks for reading it and all these awesome questions and conversations.
And this whole thing's been recorded and gets put on YouTube.
Oh yeah, cool. I'll send it to Frito.
So you can just send them the link.
Awesome.
I'll send out the link as soon as I get it uploaded, and
Yeah, I forgot about that.
you can watch the whole thing. Okay, if there's no final thoughts, thank you everyone for joining us. Remember,
Thank you for organizing.
yeah, sure. Remember,
Yes,
there's the
Yeah, thank
Calgary
you.
Hermeneutics Conference coming up. The deadline's in a month. There will be a call for papers soon for NASP this fall. And then if you're looking for an excuse to go to San Francisco, you have one. It'll be beautiful, mid-April. And hear a session on Gadamer and hermeneutics and comparative thought. So thanks, everybody.
Wear some flowers in your hair.
We're always.
So,
Okay.
bye. Take care.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.